My name is Corey Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Events and Affinity Programs here at the Office of Alumni Engagement. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Syracuse University's Orange Experience, the Science and Practice of Mindfulness. We're very excited that you're able to join us today. Before we begin today's program and get to the fun, interesting stuff, just a few housekeeping reminders. We are pleased to provide closed captioning during this program. You can just see the Zoom chat for instructions on how to do this. Make sure you do open the chat by clicking it in your toolbar so it stays up throughout the program. That's where we will take questions as they come to mind, and you have questions throughout the program, we'll take them in the chat as well. And we'll put some other important instructions and items in there for your assistance today as you participate. This program is being recorded. If you don't want your image recorded, just simply disable your video camera by clicking on the video camera icon in the lower left-hand corner. And again, we'll be addressing questions at the end of the program, but feel free to enter them in the chat throughout, and I'll be working with our speaker today to make sure we can get to as many as we can. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dessa Bergen-Cico, a professor in the development of public health and coordinator of the Addiction Studies program and faculty in trauma studies and the interdisciplinary neuroscience program at Syracuse University. I hope I got that right, Dessa.
Yeah.
She is also a certified addiction specialist and certified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher. We are so excited to have her with us today. She's going to be giving us lots of helpful information and leading us through a few exercises as well. So now we're going to transition, and I'm pleased to hand it over to you, Dessa.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. If you'd like to queue up the presentation, we're gonna, so just to make sure you're in the right room. And if you stumbled into the wrong session by chance, welcome. So we're going to be covering, as it says, both the practice and science of mindfulness. So I'm going to present some information from our research that we've been doing and those elements of it. But really, it's more of an opportunity for folks affiliated with the university to connect with some practice. We've all got Zoom fatigue by this point in the year. And there's a lot of stressful events going on socially. And so we were hoping that this would be an opportunity to do some practice as well as to engage in some content. So if we move on to the next slide. Before we begin, I'd like to start by taking a minute to do a few deep breaths together, and also to encourage you to either turn off your cell phone or set it down and put it on mute. If you've got multiple tabs open on your computer, as we're all generally multitasking, maybe close some of those out and provide yourself with the opportunity to just be focused on this one experience in the current moment. So let's begin by just taking a few deep breaths. If you're comfortable closing your eyes, I invite you to do so. If you're driving, that certainly is not a good idea. But just taking a few deep breaths and just kind of watching your breath just as you're breathing naturally. And just take an opportunity to, again, mentally separate yourself from what's been going on for you previously in the day and what you have to do at the end of this session, what's coming tomorrow, etc. Then when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes and kind of bring your awareness back into the space we have here together. Great. So can we go to the next slide? We'll start in with some of the content, and again, then we'll move into giving you an opportunity to do some practice. And so what we're hoping to cover today is to learn a little bit about some of the basic research that looks at in terms of the effectiveness of mindfulness-based practices. A lot of this research has been conducted at Syracuse University, as well as other colleagues across the country. And then looking also at how mindfulness-based practices can cultivate self-regulation of our neurobiology. So looking at the physiological impact that it can have in terms of helping us to reset ourselves. And then also looking at the restorative effects it can have on our cognition and the ability to change how our brain interacts, how it comes online and goes offline, and looking at what we call neuroplasticity. And we're going to learn and try some basic practices in terms of mindfulness. So we will do some breathing meditation, try and fit in a brief body scan. And if we have time, we'll do a few very basic sort of chair yoga moves. And then lastly, we're going to talk about and try to explore some simple ways that you can integrate this into your life. So also, if you're home and you have children that are home with you, or pets that are wandering around and distracting your attention, you can invite them to engage as well. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm assuming a lot of people who've signed up know something about mindfulness, because it's much more prevalent in our lexicon these days than it was previously. But it's one of those aspects too that, that the little icon here of the person on the left-hand side of your screen with their mind full of everything is how we generally, that's our default mode and how we generally go about our days. Whereas if you look at the mind of the dog next to the individual here, that's more what we're talking about in terms of being mindful, being focused on the present moment and not distracted by the past or not distracted by thinking forward too much. Having said that, we also know if you have a pet, especially a dog, that they're very mindful in the present moment, but if a squirrel or something like that can distract their attention, they're off and running, literally. And so that's also often how our minds work as well. So a thought, a cue, anything in the environment can kind of come in and prompt us and get our mind racing and thinking and worrying sometimes. Next slide. So again, even though when we talk about mindfulness, there's an emphasis certainly about what's going on in terms of our thought process, where our attention is, our cognition. But the fascinating elements we found in terms of research is that our thoughts literally change our neurophysiology. And so our thoughts have consequences and an impact on our neurophysiology. And so when we look at the aspect behind what's known as the stress response is, most of us are familiar with the fight or flight initiation in terms of fear, stress, anxiety, where our heart gets racing, our breathing accelerates, we have a release of adrenaline, all of those things or whatever. And those things occur not just if you're under an actual threat, but also if you're under a perceived threat. And when you worry, whether it's real or imagined, the body responds the same. Having said that, there's also a two-way, a bidirectional feedback. So when we have a release of adrenaline, or if we, our body is giving us a sensation in terms of that it's under stress or duress, that also feeds into our mind in terms of giving our mind cues of fear, arousal, that can be perpetuate sort of a tip over in terms of a panic attack, anxiety, rumination, and the like. So the frequent readjustments in terms of the body, when we look at these types of stressors, again, real or imagined, is what's known as sort of the allostatic load. And this frequent physiological readjustment can have a wearing effect on our brains and our body, and literally at the neurocell level, when we look at what are known as telomeres or telomerase, the ends of the cells that get frayed in terms of premature aging related to stress and other factors. The other thing when we look at in terms of, again, as I was saying, that our thoughts change our neurophysiology can impact our thoughts, and they can flood the body with stress hormones, again, whether it's a real or imagined situation. And so the constant sort of engagement with information, the news, anger and aggression, those types of things can get us triggered and can really start us on a feedback loop. And often it's things that we can't in the moment do something about. So finding ways to be restorative around that. And the sensations in our body are also associated with the impact that stress has on our minds. And so those are the things to keep in mind. So again, when we're looking at mindfulness, it's really mind and body. Next slide. So this is a little bit more of an illustration of just showing some of what what I was just explaining to you. And so when we look at the very simple act of, for example, meditating while focusing on our breath, and we'll try and work on that together in just a few moments. And what's also known as the body scan, where you're bringing your attention to various parts of the body that we sometimes aren't necessarily very connected with. Mindful yoga is also another key element of mindfulness-based practices. And again, this doesn't mean that you have to go get a full-blown yoga outfit or do competitive yoga. It's really more about gentle stretching. And that's an opportunity to both release some of the stress and tension that we build up in our body, and then also help us focus our mind and our attention in the present moment while we're adjusting and getting situated in relation to some of those moves. And so bringing your full attention to everyday tasks is also part of mindfulness. So it's not just the formal practice of sitting on a cushion, but bringing your full attention to things you're doing, such as washing the dishes, brushing your teeth, folding the laundry, walking, even having a conversation, because we're more often than not very distracted when we're in that moment. And so there can be formal and informal practices. And one of the things I hope you can take away from the discussion and our experience today is to recognize that there are small things you can do, what I like to call sometimes mindful snacks. So just taking 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes a few times a day if you have it, to do some awareness of breathing and some meditation or some gentle stretching or a body scan. Doing that on a regular basis has tremendous impact and benefits. And doing it regularly, even for short periods of time, actually is more beneficial than taking a weekend long retreat to go somewhere and do a mindfulness meditation or seminar. And so there's lots of ways that you can fit it into your life. And sometimes it feels maybe daunting or overwhelming. So next slide. All right, so now we're going to do we'll talk a little bit about the science of this, and then the next slide, we're going to go into a little bit of breathing exercise together. And so one of the things, I know it sounds very silly because we all breathe, but there's some intentionality around the breathing. And our breathing is both autonomic and occurs without us thinking about it, but it is also one of the functions that we can also control. So you can be intentional about slowing or speeding up your breathing. And when you inhale, that part of your breathing accesses or impacts what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is what gets going when we're physically active or when we perceive we're under threat. And the process of exhaling activates what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. So I often use a parachute to kind of illustrate what that is, because you're thinking of the parasympathetic nervous system is the counter perspective to that helps us in terms of shutting down the stress hormones and trying to calm and bring ourselves back into homeostasis and just slow things down a little bit. And so that intentional long breathing in and long breathing out that we often do in mindfulness-based meditation also helps in terms of resetting things. So when we talked before about those frequent stressors we have where we're readjusting and taxing our system in terms of real or perceived threats, the allostatic load, resetting it once a day, a couple times a day, even for short periods of time, can be really helpful. So now let's try and do a couple of breaths together, and we'll look at some intentional breathing. So next slide. Okay, so we all know how to breathe, or else we wouldn't be here at this. If you're not breathing, you have other more significant issues to worry about. But how we breathe and where we're breathing, we're not always that aware of it, and sometimes we literally do forget to breathe. And so one of the things we're going to try and do together here with a short meditation and breathing exercise is I invite you to place one hand on your belly and one hand on your chest. And just take a few deep breaths in and out, and just not to force anything, just notice which part of your body is moving. You might notice most of the movements in your chest. Maybe you notice some movement in your belly. And with the intentional breathing, what we try to do is to inhale deeply through the nose. And as you inhale, it's filling your lungs and your belly should be expanding. So maybe if you take a few deep breaths and just try to breathing in through your nose, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, feeling your belly expanding. And then as you exhale, slowly contracting, bringing your belly back in towards the spine and breathing out through the mouth and exhaling. 2, 3, 4. So that might feel very contrived and very unnatural, because we generally don't breathe that way. We generally breathe shallow up in our chest. And you'll notice if you are doing exercise, or if you're watching a scary movie or something like that, your breathing will get shallow and located up in your chest. And so trying to be intentional with that. So let's take a moment now to do some awareness of breathing meditation together. And I'm going to start us off by ringing some bells, because that helps to engage some of our auditory senses as well, and guide you through some instruction. So again, I'll invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so. If you're not, that's okay. Okay, so let's start with engaging our auditory senses here, and I'll ring the bell. So hopefully you're able to notice that ringing as it carries out actually for a relatively long period of time. And now I invite you to place your one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly if you'd like. And take a deep breath in, trying to breathe in through your nose. Notice and see if your belly expands. 2, 3, 4. Holding it for 2. 1, 2. And then exhaling, contracting your belly back in towards the spine and breathing out through your mouth. This time we're going to do it in a count of 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's try that again. Breathing in through your nose. 2, 3, 4. Holding it for 2. 1, 2. And then exhaling, bringing the belly back in towards the spine. Breathing out through the mouth. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So one of the reasons that we do a longer exhale is we're trying to do more activation of our sympathetic nerve or parasympathetic nervous system to slow ourselves down a little bit. So now you can count to yourself internally. Again, just breathing in through your nose, counting to 4, holding for 2, and exhaling for 6. And the last one, just at your own pace. Now I invite you to open your eyes and come back into the present moment. So that's just a little part of an example of the one part component where we try to become aware of our breathing. Sometimes it feels, as I said, unnatural or less natural. And the aspects you want to kind of keep in mind too is that it's more important that you're anchoring your attention on your breathing than it is that you have a contrived intentional breathing in and breathing out. If you are particularly anxious or stressed or trying to engage your parasympathetic nervous system, that type of intentional deep breath in and deep breath out can be really helpful in terms of you kind of grounding yourself and resetting things. But for the most part, really all you're trying to do with the mindful meditation is just find an anchor that you always have with you, which is your breath. And letting your breath be the guide and hooking your attention to that. And you watch the breath that's coming in and going out. Sounds very simple, but it's very easy to have our mind wander off somewhere. And it's an anchor that we use really as a component for a sort of backdrop of noticing what it is that our mind does. Where does our mind go to? What are the things that come up? What are the lists we start making? What are the things we start worrying about, et cetera, et cetera. And so by having that neutral source, the breathing that we anchor it to, we begin to see more clearly how our mind works, recognize what's coming up for us. What are the continuous worries, or what is the worry today, or what are the thoughts? And it's a way of being able to see more clearly and more honestly what's going on with ourselves. And that also helps us to be that way with other folks as well. So we'll come back if we have a moment to do some more exercises together. Let's go to the next slide here. Another key exercise in with the mindfulness-based practice, and as I said, it's very much the mind-body connection around these things. And there's when you look at it, most all of our thoughts originate from our thoughts and actions originate from sensations in the body. And so I remember when I first read that, I thought that can't be true. But as you observe more regularly, you find that in fact, whether it's a memory or if you suddenly say, oh, I forgot I have to do that or whatever, there's a sensation that originates in the body. And so connecting ourselves with what's going on in the body helps us in terms of connecting and being aware of what's going on with our thoughts. And so the body scan has a particular sequence in terms of looking at reintegration and connection of all of the various parts in the body. And so I've got them outlined here. If you do a full body scan, that can take, there's guided audio, free audio recordings online for doing a mindfulness-based body scan, and it can take 35-40 minutes if you do it the full slow way, and we're certainly not going to do that today. But we can try now together to do a brief body scan. And so again, I'll invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable. And I'll walk you through a very short type of body scan. One thing to call attention to is sometimes if I encourage you to bring your attention, for example, to your left foot, which is often where we start, you may realize that you have no sensation there, and you're not even physically aware of your left foot, and that's totally normal. There's a lot of parts in our body that if they're not in pain, we tend not to necessarily, and we're not doing anything with them, then there is no sensation there. We're not necessarily aware of that. The other thing to bring up is that sometimes if you have chronic pain, so if you have back pain, arthritis, an injury, anything like that, if I invite you to bring your attention to that part of the body, sometimes that feels uncomfortable. So if the sensation is too intense, then you can do what we call titrating. And titrating is then you bring your attention to a part of the body that feels neutral. Often that can be a hand. So unless, again, you have an injury or arthritis or something else that's going on that's very painful to your hand, that can be a place for you to titrate and flip your attention to. So I'll walk you through a short practice here with the body scan, and I'll begin with ringing the bells again. So here I invite you, if you'd like to close your eyes. If you're seated in a chair or on the floor, I invite you to draw your attention to where your body's making contact with the chair. Noticing where, if you're standing or even if you're seated in a chair, the points where your feet are making contact with the floor. And then just breathing in and breathing out. I invite you to draw your attention to your left foot and just noticing any sensation you might have there. And then with the next breath in and the next breath out, I invite you to bring your attention up to your lower left leg. It's kind of running your mind's eye over that part of the body. And just observing any sensation you might have there. And then with the next breath in, the next breath out, I invite you to bring your attention to the upper left leg. Again, noticing any sensations you might have here, and just breathing in and breathing out. Now I invite you to bring your attention to your right foot. Perhaps you notice the sensation of it touching the floor, sensation of your shoe or your sock. And the next breath in and the next breath out, I invite you to explore the sensations in the lower right part of your leg. And then when you're ready, I invite you to bring your attention to your upper right leg, just breathing in and breathing out. Now I invite you to bring your attention to your bottom and your midsection, where you may be making contact with the floor, a chair. And just noticing any sensations you may have in this area as you're breathing in and breathing out. And next, I invite you to bring your attention to your belly. Just notice if there's any sensation there, any tightness, seeing if it's in fact moving as you breathe in and breathe out. Next, I invite you to bring your attention to your upper part of your torso, your chest. You might notice the sensation of your heart beating, some movement from your breathing. And then I invite you to bring your attention to your left arm. Just as you're breathing in and breathing out, noticing any sensations from the shoulder to the forearm to your hand. And then when you're ready, I invite you to bring your attention over to the right arm. Again, moving from the shoulder down to the elbow, through the forearm, the hand, and your fingers. Now, lastly, I invite you to bring your attention to your neck, your jaw, noticing any sensation you might have here, any tension there might be. If you notice some tension just as you're breathing in and breathing out, seeing if you can adjust your physical posture to loosen that up a little bit. As you breathe out, make an effort to try to relax any of that tension. And now I invite you, as you're breathing in, to bring your attention to your sinuses, your face. And as you're breathing out, bring your attention to your mouth as the air exhales. And then lastly, I invite you to bring your attention to the sensations behind your eyes, your forehead, crown of your head. Just breathing in and breathing out. Now in just a moment, I'm going to ring the bell and bring your attention back into the space we have here together. And I invite you to open your eyes and come into the present moment. So again, that doesn't take particularly long, but it can be a complete reset when we are stressed. If we can move on to the next slide, I hate to pull us back into our heads after we've just been in our body and we're probably feeling pretty kind of zen. But we'll come back into this. So I mentioned earlier that usually the way that our mind operates is in what's known as default mode. And there's a cluster of regions of the brain that are engaged in what we call the default mode network. And this is very much like the picture we saw in the earlier part of the slide with the human with all of the activities going on. You're thinking, fantasizing, worrying, planning, all of those types of things that are going on in the mind. And there's the interesting research that they've done with in neuroscience and looking at brain scan activity is when we find that the time that is spent in the default mode activation of our brains, it's negatively associated with satisfaction with life, negatively associated with psychological well-being, and it's also positively associated with depression and anxiety. And so there's been a lot of research that we've done with veterans, with young people, with college students, and have found that even brief practices with mindfulness-based meditation, as little as once a week for 4 weeks, reduces significantly depression and anxiety. And it's not just state anxiety, but when we look at trait anxiety, so for helping people, it helps people in terms of shifting which part of their brain is activated and starting to get out of some of the narrative that can drive some of the negative mood states. The other thing is interesting too. So if you go beyond the health and well-being components of how mindfulness can be helpful, some of the work and the research that is being done around it is also looking at increasing attention and productivity. And so if you're in the default mode network is more strongly associated with error and lack of productivity, which in some ways makes sense, is that it's kind of like your computer. If you've got all these programs running and it's kind of slow and doesn't operate very well because there's too many windows open. Same thing going on where your brain is, multitasking in many different areas and nothing much is getting done very well. We can go on to the next one. So how does mindfulness work? So I wanted to be able to share with you a little bit about when we look at what are the mechanisms of change and what happens, because for most people who are just participating in the body scan, that was probably a calming, pleasant experience, but being still and being calm doesn't feel good to everyone. And so there's processes of getting ourselves comfortable with that stillness. And the fact that it doesn't feel comfortable is also often what drives us in terms of perpetual busyness, because it feels uncomfortable to be slow or to be in the present moment. And so mindfulness is more than just feeling calm while you're doing the practice. What we're looking at is rewiring and reworking our default mode network and our automatic thought processes. So what the research has shown is that mindfulness-based practices help to quiet the default mode network, and so that doesn't become your default go-to. And the default mode network is connected with self-related thinking and mind wandering, and these the self-related thinking and mind wandering can be very kind of challenging and somewhat destructive in terms of when you think of things like depression and anxiety, the constant concerns about what's due, what are people thinking about me, why did this person say that, I regret having done this, so on and so forth. And so those are the types of things that when we look at that. The other thing we found is that it increases productivity or activity in what's called the task positive network. And the task positive network is the opposite of the default mode network. And so the aim here isn't necessarily to be, make your mind so that you're super productive all the time, But what happens in task positive network is that your focused concentration, sustained attention on the task at hand, what's occurring in the present moment. And it also gives you the opportunity to choose where you direct your attention as opposed to it being led around by your meandering thoughts. And so this is associated with improved psychological well-being, decision-making, cognition, attention, and the like. A simple way of kind of contrasting the two is that when we are in default mode network, when we're very stressed or whatever, we get forgetful, we misplace things, when we're prone to injuries and accidents. And again, it's because our attention is diverted, and there's often a disconnect between mind and body. And then also we have found that mindfulness-based practices improve physical well-being through things like decreases in terms of cortisol output, which is associated as a stress hormone. And we have this bidirectional relationship, as I said before, with neurophysiology of stress and with cognition. And when we look at psychosomatic elements related to health and well-being, it doesn't mean that it's just all in your head or whatever, that those thoughts and those habits of mind are associated with and can redirect what's happening with us neurophysiologically. So those are some of the things that happen with mindfulness, sustained mindfulness practice. And again, short amounts, regular basis, once a week for an hour or 5 minutes a day, for as long as you can do it. Next slide. So one of the things, and there won't be any quiz on this, so you don't have to be too worried. But I do want to respect the fact that as Syracuse alums or affiliates or whatever, that you're an intelligent group of folks. And so some of the research that we did actually last spring 2019 with students who are doing mindfulness-based meditation practice. We had a device called the FNIRS, which measures hemodynamic blood flow, and we were looking at that in relation to cognitive tasks. And so we found that there was 3 key areas of the brain that there were significant changes in terms of activation. One was the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the other was frontopolar area, and the third was the orbital frontal cortex. And so if you can, they're kind of highlighted in the image of the brain here, all in the frontal region. What's important to note there is if we look at kind of what is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is indicative of engaging the task positive network and the ability to self-regulate. So when we're looking at self-regulation of thought, self-regulation in terms of behavior, self-regulation in terms of your physiological stress response. The frontopolar area is important for short-term memory and working memory, and these are things that are really important for the learning process, right? When you're taking in information, can you retain it? Are you in the present moment and listening to what's happening in the classroom, or are you trolling on Instagram or whatever and completely unaware? Or are you very stressed by all the things that are going on in your life? And this is, short-term memory, working memory is where did I put my keys 2 minutes ago and those types of things. So some of us know what that's like when that declines a bit. And the orbital frontal cortex, that's the area associated with the stress response and is very sensitive to stress effects. So to see these significant changes with the students who are practicing this as part of integration in their coursework or whatever was really amazing to see, because those are things you can't fake, right? And so self-report surveys are important as well. So when we look at in terms of reductions of reported trait anxiety, stress, and post-traumatic stress, those are important. But when we have neurophysiological shifts or whatever, that really helps to show the efficacy of how these practices can benefit folks. Next slide. So one of the things, just to, again, look at a little bit about how does this work, and the little diagram I have here, if you start with the orange box, of course, at the top, where we're looking at applying mindfulness skills as responses to stressors, and then moving downward from there, with continued practice, you cultivate new neural networks and establish new behaviors. So instead of being reactive, it gives you just a millisecond to kind of slow things down and be able to respond. The sustained relief in terms of attention and the opportunity to respond then can also help disrupt what otherwise might be sometimes habitual habits in terms of a short fuse or how we respond in terms of anger or frustration. And this here is particularly, I've gotten this diagram linked to looking at in terms of thoughts, sensations, cravings, or whatever, because a lot of the work I do is looking at sometimes addictive behaviors, and that can be anything from gaming and gambling to substance use, shopping, all types of things. And then also just as well as being aware of habits of mind. And so if you can decouple kind of the connection between those two pieces, that's what the mindfulness helps you to be aware of. What's my motivation for what I'm doing and how did I end up here? And then kind of being able to make a choice rather than doing what has just become habitual. And that can be habitual in terms of habits of mind, behaviors, and the like. Next slide. So as we wind down here, whatever, one of the things I would like to also emphasize is with mindfulness-based practices or mindfulness skills is really, it's just building on your personal strengths. It's not deficit focused as much of what we tend to look at in terms of mental health and well-being tends to sometimes look at deficits. It's really about finding your personal strengths and helping to see where you can integrate this into what's already part of your life and your practice. It's low cost. You can find a lot of very good resources online that are actually no cost. You can also enroll in expensive programs, but it's available to everyone, and it's always with you. And so when life becomes challenging or when you're in a difficult situation, being able to center yourself, ground yourself in terms of recognizing where you physically are, engage in some deep breathing techniques or whatever, that can really help you to be able to make an informed decision about what steps you're taking next or how to respond instead of just reacting. And so as we have seen with this year where every day something new and crazy seems to be happening in the news, and socially, with COVID, et cetera, we can't stop the waves that keep coming our way and hitting us, but we can learn to kind of surf those waves and find a different way to go with the flow, so to speak, and be resilient when it seems overwhelming.
Thank you so much, Dessa, for your time today. This was fascinating. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you got as much out of this as we did.